There is a question no one asks at a funeral, and it may be the only question worth asking. What do you still owe the person in that casket? Not what you felt for them, not what they meant to you, what you owe them. Present tense. If that question lands strangely, if it sounds like a category error, like asking what you owe last Tuesday's weather, you are not alone. We have been trained, quietly and thoroughly, to believe that death dissolves obligation, that the relationship ends when the breathing does, that what remains is grief, and grief has a season, and when the season passes, you are released. This video is going to argue that we were trained wrong, and the argument doesn't come from sentiment, it doesn't come from religious consolation, though it is not opposed to faith. It comes from the oldest contract theory in Western civilization, one that most people in this country have never heard of, because it was displaced 2 centuries ago by a younger, more optimistic version that became the only story modern Americans know how to tell about what we owe each other. By the end of this video, you'll have a word for what you've been feeling. And you'll understand why the man whose ideas anchor everything on this channel believed that word so deeply he named his home after it. Start with the scene. You know this one. It has been 3 years since you visited the grave. Maybe 4. You didn't stop going from cruelty. You were busy, you moved, the drive got longer. Life accumulated the way life does. The marker is still there, the name is still carved. But the visit stopped, and some part of you knows it, and some part of you has been uncomfortable with the knowing. Or maybe it's not a grave. Maybe it's a name you no longer say aloud. Your grandfather's trade, the one he practiced for 40 years, and you don't quite remember what it was called. Your grandmother's recipe, the one she made every Thanksgiving, and you realize you never wrote it down, and now there's no one left to ask. The small inheritance, not the money, the other kind, that you received and then, without deciding to, set down somewhere and walked away from. You didn't mean to. That's the thing. There was no moment of rejection, no deliberate turning away. There was only the forward motion of living, which is relentless, and the past, which kept receding the way a shoreline recedes when you're out on the water. And now you are here, and they are there, in the ground, in photographs, in a box of papers no one has opened in a decade. And the question is whether the relationship still requires something of you. The modern answer is not really. The modern answer is that grief is the debt, and grief was paid. You showed up, you cried, you said the right things at the service, you got through the first year. That was the obligation. What comes after is voluntary, a matter of sentiment, of personal attachment, of how long you happen to feel the loss. Some people feel it longer than others, that's all. This answer is compassionate, in its way. It doesn't demand, it releases you. And most of what surrounds you, the culture, the implicit assumptions of mobile American life, the whole architecture of a society that treats the individual as the primary unit, and the present moment as the primary tense, most of it quietly endorses this answer. The trouble is that it doesn't actually describe what you feel. If the modern answer were true, if death really did dissolve the obligation, then why the discomfort? Why the low-grade unease when your grandchildren don't know your grandfather's name? Why the particular weight of the unopened box of papers? Sentiment doesn't produce that kind of specific gravity. Sentiment dissipates. What you're feeling has more structure than sentiment. It has the shape of an unfulfilled duty. That shape has a name. And the name is older than the Republic, older than the Church as most Americans practice it, older than Christianity itself in its Western form. The name is Pietas. Most people who have heard this word have heard it in its modern, diminished form. Piety. Personal religious feeling. The quiet, private devotion of a faithful person. A virtue of the interior life, valuable and real, but essentially individual. Essentially disconnected from specific obligations to specific people across time. That is not what the Romans meant. For a Roman, pietas was not a feeling. It was a legal and moral category, a structured system of obligations running in 3 directions simultaneously, to the gods, to the patria, and to the ancestors. It was the duty to perform the rites, to maintain the memory, to carry forward the work that those who came before you could no longer do for themselves. Cicero, in De Officiis, treated it as one of the foundational civic virtues, not because it was beautiful, but because without it, the whole structure of inherited civilization came apart. You could not have a city of people who owed nothing to their dead. That city would be a collection of strangers, not a people. The English word piety collapsed all of this into personal religious feelings sometime in the 17th and 18th centuries. As the Latin tradition receded and the Protestant emphasis on the individual's direct relationship with God reshaped the vocabulary, what had been a structured obligation became a private disposition. What had been a claim became a sentiment. Russell Kirk knew this. He had read Cicero carefully. You don't come out of his work without that impression. And when he named his home in Mecosta, Michigan, Piety Hill, he was not reaching for a pastoral, evocative name for a country house. He was making a compressed civilizational argument in 2 words. He was saying, this place is where the old obligation is honored. This is where pietas, the real thing, the Roman thing, is practiced. Most people who encounter the name assume it means the first thing, the private interior Protestant meaning. It sounds like the name of a quiet, faithful place. And it is that. But it is also a demand. You'll understand why that matters before this video is over. First, the philosophical foundation. Because Pietas didn't arrive in Russell Kirk's mind fully formed, he inherited it the way he inherited everything he valued, through a long chain of thinkers who passed it forward across centuries. And a crucial link in that chain was Edmund Burke. Burke wrote his reflections on the Revolution in France in 1790, and it remains one of the most important political documents in the English language. Not because it got everything right, but because it named something the revolutionaries were destroying that they didn't know they were destroying. The revolutionaries believed they were building a new society on rational principles. They were going to clear away the accumulated debris of the past, its hierarchies, its inherited privileges, its irrational traditions, and construct something clean, logical, free. The living would decide for themselves, without reference to the dead, what kind of society they wanted to inhabit. Burke watched this and felt something in the architecture of civilization giving way. And he reached for a metaphor that has never been surpassed. Society, Burke wrote, is indeed a contract, but it is not a contract like a trade agreement, or a lease, or a business partnership. An arrangement between contemporary parties for mutual benefit, dissolvable when the terms no longer suit either side. It is, he wrote, a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue, and in all perfection. And then came the sentence that changed everything. It becomes a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. Read that carefully. Not a contract between contemporaries, a contract between the living, the dead, and the unborn. This is the vertical contract. It runs through time, not across it. And it is the oldest political theory in the Western tradition, older than Locke, older than Rousseau, older than the social contract, as most Americans learned it. The horizontal contract, individuals in the present negotiating their terms with each other, is the young one, the modern invention. Burke's contract, pietas as political philosophy, is the ancient one. Kirk received this from Burke and made it the cornerstone of everything he built. In The Conservative Mind, published in 1953, he named the principle of continuity as one of the distinguishing features of genuine conservatism. The belief that the living are not free agents who happen to share a moment in time, but inheritors of an ongoing obligation that they received from the dead and must transmit to the unborn. The wise conservative, Kirk wrote, knows that the body social is an intricate structure worked out painfully over a great many centuries, embodying the experience and the aspirations of many generations. A year later, in a program for conservatives, he went further. The individual, he argued, is not a terminal point, not a final destination where the inheritance arrives and stops. The individual is a link in a chain, a receiver and a transmitter, and the chain runs in both directions. The dead put something in your hands. The question is whether you will pass it forward or let it drop. That is the eternal contract, not a metaphor, a structural description of what civilization actually is and how it actually works. If what you're hearing is landing, if the word pietas is doing something in you that piety never quite did, there's a next step that isn't more reading or more watching. It's a 30-day workbook, 1 page a day. Each one anchored to a specific idea from Kirk's tradition, with a reflection question and a practical prompt. It's called Order Your Soul First, and it's linked in the description. Not for the person who wants more content. For the person who is done with passive consumption and ready for something real. Now, the question that the philosophical foundation opens but doesn't answer. Did Kirk believe this? Not as an intellectual position, as a way of living. He believed it the way a man believes something when he acts on it when no one is watching. Kirk lived at Piety Hill for most of his adult life. The house in Mecosta, Michigan was not a retreat or a weekend property. It was his primary argument, a place he built into a community of hospitality, of scholarship, of deliberate continuity. He received young conservatives and young writers there for decades. He maintained a library, not as a private collection, but as what he would have called a stewardship. Books held in trust for those who would come after. He married late, at 46 by most accounts, and fathered 4 daughters. The late marriage is sometimes noted as a biographical curiosity. It was not a curiosity. It was the act of a man who understood that the chain required him to pass something forward, and who waited until he found the right person to do it with. He did not rush the decision because he understood what the decision meant. And then there is this. Kirk buried his friend Clinton Wallace in the family cemetery at Piety Hill. Not a public cemetery. Not a churchyard. The family cemetery on his own property in Mecosta. Think about what that act means. Kirk didn't just maintain an intellectual position about obligation to the dead. He made room for his dead on his own land. He chose, deliberately, to be in proximity to those who had gone before, to have their markers visible from his window, to walk past them, to tend the ground where they lay. This cemetery at Piety Hill is not a romantic gesture. It is pietas practiced in the most literal sense available to a man in 20th century Michigan. It is the refusal to allow death to dissolve the relationship. This is what it looks like when someone actually believes what they say. Now the thing that has been waiting at the edge of this entire video. You have been watching a channel called Piety Hill. You may have noticed the name and assumed, reasonably, that it was a reference to Kirk's home, that it was a kind of tribute, a geographical anchor for a channel built on his ideas. And it is that. But there is something else encoded in those 2 words that you now have the vocabulary to hear. The channel is not named after a place. It is named after an obligation, pietas. The Roman legal duty to the dead. The Burkean vertical contract. The Kirkian chain running from those who came before to those who have not yet arrived. That is what this channel is named after. Not as an act of nostalgia, not as a tribute to a specific man's Michigan property, but as a statement of what this channel exists to practice and to ask of you. The name was the argument the whole time. You were inside it before you knew what it meant. That is the inversion Kirk loved. Not the clever reversal, not the rhetorical trick. The genuine reordering that makes you look back at what you thought you understood and see it differently. The channel you've been watching was always a demand. The question it has been asking, every video, in a dozen different forms, is the same question. What do you owe? To the dead who shaped you, to the living who depend on you, to the unborn who will receive what you pass forward or what you drop. Here is what the modern answer gets wrong. The modern answer, that death dissolves obligation, was designed for a world of strangers. It is the answer you give to people who have no connection to each other except their simultaneous presence in the same moment. It is the answer of the horizontal contract, the contract of contemporaries. And for certain purposes, in certain contexts, it is a reasonable answer. But you are not a stranger to your dead. You are their continuation. You speak with words they gave you, in a language shaped by people who died before your grandparents were born. You carry moral intuitions that were formed in communities you never knew, by arguments made in centuries you did not inhabit. You are, whether you acknowledge it or not, the current expression of an ongoing inheritance. The question is not whether you received it, you did. The question is what you will do with it. The sociologist Robert Bellah, writing in Habits of the Heart in 1985, called the dominant American self-understanding ontological individualism, the belief that the self is the primary unit, that it precedes its relationships and its inheritances, that it is, at bottom, self-originating. Bellah wasn't a conservative, and he didn't reach for Kirk, but he diagnosed the same disease Kirk had been treating since 1953, the severing of the vertical connection, the reduction of the contract to a horizontal arrangement between people who happen to share a moment in time. When you sever the connection to the dead, you don't just lose the past, you lose the future. Burke saw it clearly. A generation that owes nothing to its ancestors will also feel no obligation to its descendants. The chain doesn't just run backward. The logic that releases you from pietas toward your grandfather also, eventually, releases your grandchildren from pietas toward you. The obligation is indivisible. You cannot accept it in one direction and refuse it in the other. This is why Kirk's worry in 1953 was not nostalgic. It was structural. He was not mourning a better past. He was describing the mechanism by which a civilization dismantles itself, and he was describing it from primary observation in a country that was already, in the early years of post-war prosperity, beginning the work of disconnection. So what does the obligation actually look like? What does Pietas ask of a man or woman in their 60s or 70s in 2026? Not the grave visit, though that is not nothing. Not the family genealogy project, though that is not nothing either. It asks first that you refuse the consolation of the modern answer. That you resist the permission structure that tells you the debt was paid at the funeral and what remains is optional. The refusal is not dramatic. It doesn't require a public act. It requires the private acknowledgement, honest, undeceived, that you are carrying something that was given to you, that you did not earn, that you are obligated to transmit. It asks, second, that you name what you received, your grandfather's way of living in the world, even if you can't articulate it yet. Your grandmother's faith, even if it expressed itself differently than yours does. The moral vocabulary you were handed in childhood, before you knew it was a vocabulary and before you had any choice about receiving it. Name it. Give it words. A thing you cannot name, you cannot pass forward. It asks, third, that you act as a transmitter, not a terminal. That you resist the temptation, and it is a temptation because it is easier to let the chain end with you, not to burden your children, not to impose, not to be the difficult one who keeps dragging the past into the present. Kirk would not accept this framing. The past is not a burden you are imposing. It is a country you are introducing your descendants to. The introduction is the obligation, and it asks, finally, patience with the asymmetry. The dead cannot receive what you give them. They are not waiting for the visit. They cannot read the letter. They will not know you remembered. The obligation runs in one direction only, forward. What you owe the dead, you pay by what you do for the living and the unborn. That is the logic of the vertical contract. The payment is never made to the creditor directly. It is made to the chain. Kirk understood this not just as a philosopher, but as a man who felt the full weight of being a link. He was not born into wealth or influence. He built what he built from what he received. The English literary tradition, the Roman moral tradition, the Christian intellectual tradition, and he passed it forward through his writing, his home, his hospitality, and his daughters. He could not know what those daughters would do with what he gave them. He could not know whether the conservative mind would outlast its decade or become a permanent fixture. He acted anyway because the obligation did not depend on certainty of outcome. It depended only on the recognition that you are not self-originating, that you received something, and that the receiving creates the duty. The soul before the republic, not as a slogan, as a sequence. The interior order first, the recognition of what you received, the naming of it, the decision to transmit it. Then, and only then, whatever you do in the public square, whatever you argue in the family room, whatever you leave behind in the form your life takes when it is finished. You asked, or the question asked itself through you, what do you owe the dead? Here is the answer the oldest tradition in the West has to offer. You owe them continuation, not imitation. You are not your grandfather, and the world he inhabited does not exist in the form he knew it, but continuation. The thread that ran through him runs through you now, and if you choose to be a terminal point, if you set down what he handed you quietly and without drama and walk forward unburdened, the thread ends. The thread ending is not a neutral act. It has a cost, paid by people who will never know what they didn't receive. Pietas. Not piety, not sentiment, not the private interior feeling of a faithful person in a quiet moment. The structured obligation of a link in a chain, to those who came before, to those who will come after, to the civilization that is only real insofar as each generation chooses to receive it and transmit it. That is what this channel is named for. That is what Kirk named his home for. That is what you have been carrying, unnamed, for longer than you probably know. The question that remains, the one this video cannot answer for you, the one only you can answer, is not whether you received something. You did. It is not whether the obligation is real. It is. The question is, what will you do, specifically, with what was placed in your hands, not in general? Specifically, the name you've almost let fade, the story no one else remembers, the faith that arrived imperfect and worth continuing anyway, the work your father left unfinished. What will you do with it? Tell me in the comments below, what is the one thing you've been trying to pass forward and haven't yet found the words to name?